Unsolved, the Shadow Family Audience Warning Disclaimer. The following content contains graphic descriptions of violence and disturbing themes that some viewers may find distressing. This story is intended for mature audiences 18 years and older only. The names of all individuals involved have been changed to protect their identities. While based on investigative research, some details have been altered for privacy and legal reasons. Detective Shernan's case, Files. The room is dimly lit. A desk cluttered with case files, photographs, and coffee rings on scattered papers. A weathered man in his 50s sits before the camera, his eyes carrying the weight of countless unsolved cases. My name is Detective Marcus Shernan. For over 25 years, I've specialized in cold cases, the ones that haunt the halls of police departments across the country. The forgotten victims, the unsolved mysteries, the shadows that never quite fade away. Today, I'm going to take you deep into one of the most disturbing cases I've ever worked a case that still keeps me awake at night, wondering if we'll ever truly know what happened behind those suburban doors. I call it the Shadow Family. April rain pattered against my office window that morning in 2018 when the file landed on my desk. Chief Winters gave me that look, the one that said this wasn't going to be easy. Shernan, this one's been gathering dust for almost 4 years. Multiple victims, family annihilation. But something doesn't add up. I've seen my share of family annihilators, those who murder their entire families before taking their own lives or disappearing. But as I began reading through the details of the Moreau family case, I realized this was something different. Let me take you back to where it all began. The Blaze. It was a quiet neighborhood in Lakewood, Pennsylvania, the kind where people still bring casseroles when new neighbors move in. The kind where children ride bikes until streetlights come on and garage doors stay unlocked. The Moreau family home sat at the end of Oak Lane, a 2-story colonial with white shutters and a sprawling backyard that backed up to a wooded area. From the outside, they seemed like the perfect family. Richard Moreau, 58, ran a successful construction company. His wife, Elena, 57, taught piano from their home. Their 3 sons, James, 32, Nathan, 29, and Thomas, 26, had all done reasonably well for themselves. Thomas, the youngest, lived at home with his wife, Sarah, and their 1-year-old daughter, Lily. In the early morning hours of November 12, 2014, at precisely 2:13 a.m., according to neighbor Virginia Caldwell's statement, flames erupted from the rear of the Moreau family home. Virginia had been awakened by an unusual brightness filtering through her bedroom curtains. When she looked out her window, she saw orange flames climbing the back wall of her neighbor's house. I'll never forget the way the fire moved, Virginia told me years later, her hands trembling as she spoke. It wasn't normal. It was like it had a mind of its own, racing up the walls, consuming everything. Virginia immediately called 911. Firefighters arrived within 7 minutes fast for a rural area, but by then, the back of the house was fully engulfed. Now, if you're wondering what makes a detective like me immediately suspicious, it's timing. House fires that start between midnight and 5 a.m. are statistically more likely to be arson. People are asleep. Witnesses are few. Response times are slower. And in this case, the fire had started at the rear of the house away from the street, away from potential witnesses. When first responders arrived, they found Nathan Moreau, the middle son, pacing frantically on the front lawn. According to the initial report, Nathan was shouting, "They're still inside! My family's still inside!" Nathan had escaped because he'd left the house around 2 a.m. to start his delivery route for the local newspaper, a job he'd taken to supplement his income while trying to launch his own small business. By all accounts, he was distraught, repeatedly attempting to run back into the burning house until firefighters physically restrained him. But here's where things get complicated. Nathan told first responders that 7 people were inside the home: his parents, Richard and Elena, his older brother, James, his younger brother, Thomas, Thomas's wife, Sarah, their baby, Lily, and his uncle, Victor, who was visiting from out of town. By the time firefighters had controlled the blaze enough to enter the structure, most of the second floor had collapsed. In the charred remains, they found 5 bodies: Richard Moreau, baby Lily, James, Sarah, and Uncle Victor. Elena and Thomas had survived but were critically injured with severe burns and smoke inhalation. Both were unconscious when transported to Mercy Regional Hospital, but one person remained unaccounted for. Despite meticulous searching through the debris, emergency personnel couldn't locate Nathan's older brother, James. Where was he? Had he somehow escaped unnoticed? Was he trapped under debris that rescue workers couldn't access? Or was there another explanation entirely? The question lingered as investigators combed through the still smoldering remains of what had once been a family home. Have you ever stood in the ruins of a house fire? There's a peculiar silence that settles over charred wood and melted plastic. The acrid smell clings to your clothes for days. It gets into your hair, under your fingernails. It's the smell of lives disrupted, memories reduced to ash. As I walked through what remained of the Moreau home 4 years later, that smell still lingered faintly, like a ghost that refused to leave. Beneath the ashes, when I reopened this case in 2018, the first thing I did was review the initial findings from the fire investigator, Marcus Jenkins. His report contained something that the family hadn't been told, something that changed everything about this case. Jenkins had noted that beneath the burns and smoke damage on the recovered bodies, there were knife wounds, deep, deliberate stab wounds that couldn't have been caused by falling debris or the fire itself. This wasn't just a house fire, it was a massacre disguised as an accident. Richard Moreau had been stabbed 17 times, primarily in the chest and neck. Baby Lily had a single knife wound to the chest. Sarah had 12 stab wounds concentrated in her back and shoulders, suggesting she'd been attacked from behind, possibly while trying to reach her daughter. Uncle Victor had sustained 8 stab wounds, mostly defensive injuries on his arms and hands, indicating he had tried to fight back. The survivors, Elena and Thomas, also had multiple stab wounds. Medical reports showed Elena had been stabbed 9 times and Thomas 11 times. It was a miracle they had survived at all. I remember sitting in my office, looking at the autopsy photos, trying to make sense of the brutality. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a spontaneous act of violence. The attacker had methodically moved from room to room. No one was spared, not even a 1-year-old child. If you were in this situation right now, I whisper to myself sometimes when reviewing these files, what would you do? Would you run? Would you fight? Would you freeze? It's a question I often ask my audience to consider, because these split-second decisions can mean the difference between life and death. The Moreau family likely had just seconds to react, and by all evidence, some of them tried to fight back. 3 days after I reopened the case, I received a call that would add another layer to this already complex investigation. Thomas Moreau had regained consciousness after being in a medically induced coma for weeks following the attack. His first words, according to the nurse who had been checking his vitals, were, "James did this. James killed my daughter." The missing brother, James Moreau, 32, the eldest son, Harvard Business School graduate, investment banker at Reynolds Klein in Philadelphia, by all accounts, successful, well-liked, stable, and now the prime suspect in a family annihilation. The manhunt for James began immediately after Thomas's accusation. His photo was circulated to law enforcement agencies statewide, then nationally. His bank accounts were frozen, his credit cards flagged, his phone tracked, though it had last pinged near the family home on the night of the murders and hadn't been active since. I pulled up James's personnel file from his employer. His supervisor described him as brilliant but intense, noting that he regularly worked 80-hour weeks and had recently been passed over for a promotion he'd been virtually guaranteed. Co-workers described him as private, saying he rarely discussed his family or personal life. His apartment in Philadelphia was spotless when police searched it, almost unnaturally so. No photos, minimal personal effects, a closet full of expensive suits, a refrigerator containing nothing but bottled water and protein shakes. It felt less like a home and more like a hotel room. But the most revealing evidence came from James's internet search history in the weeks leading up to the murders. How to stage a house fire, do knife wounds show up after cremation, family annihilator psychology, countries without U.S. extradition. These searches painted a picture of premeditation, of someone meticulously planning to eliminate his entire family and disappear. But why? What could drive a successful young man to such extremes? The breakthrough in locating James came from an unexpected source, his father's funeral. "Watch the funeral," I told the surveillance team. Family killers often return to witness the aftermath of their actions. It gives them a sense of power, of control. A team of plainclothes officers positioned themselves around the funeral home on the day of the combined service for Richard and baby Lily. The remaining family members had decided to hold a joint funeral while Elena and Thomas were still recovering in the hospital. The service was packed. Richard had been well respected in the community, and the tragic death of an infant had brought out even those who had known the family only peripherally. Among the mourners, officers noticed a man standing at the back, wearing dark glasses and a baseball cap pulled low. He kept his distance from other attendees, never signing the guest book, never approaching the caskets. When the service ended, he was one of the first to leave. Officers followed him to a parking lot 3 blocks away where he had left a rental car with Ohio plates. As he unlocked the door, they moved in. James Moreau offered no resistance when arrested. According to the arresting officer's report, he seemed almost relieved, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. The interrogation. I've conducted hundreds of interrogations in my career. I've sat across from gang members, domestic abusers, armed robbers, even a few serial killers. But I've rarely encountered someone like James Moreau. When I watch the recording of his interrogation now, what strikes me isn't what he says, but how he says it. There's a flatness to his effect, a disconnect between the horror of his alleged actions and his emotional response. Detective Ramirez, who conducted the initial questioning, begins with the standard approach. "James, do you know why you're here?" James nods slowly. because of what happened at my parents' house. And what happened there, James? A long pause. James stares at his hands, folded neatly on the metal table. I think you already know. I need you to tell me. Ramirez pushes. Another pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, they cut off my internet. Ramirez leans forward, not sure he's heard correctly. I'm sorry? My father. He cut off my internet access. I was angry. James says this with the same emotion someone might use to describe being mildly inconvenienced in traffic. The room falls silent. Even watching the recording years later, I can feel the shock that must have permeated that interrogation room. You murdered your family because your father cut off your internet? Ramirez eventually asks. James looks up, meeting his eyes for the first time. Yes, it's absurd. It's unbelievable. It's the kind of motive that makes no sense, which is exactly why it caught my attention. In my experience, when a suspect offers a motive that seems wildly disproportionate to the crime, one of two things is happening. Either they're lying to conceal the real motive, or there's much more beneath the surface that we don't yet understand. As the interrogation continued, James remained largely cooperative, but emotionally detached. He confirmed he had stabbed his family members before setting fire to the house to cover his tracks. When asked about baby Lily, he showed no remorse, stating only that she was crying and he needed it to be quiet. But something about his confession doesn't sit right with me, even now. It's too neat, too simple. The internet story feels like a cover either a lie or a gross simplification of something much more complex. I decided to dig deeper into James's background, beyond the polished Harvard resume and the successful banking career. What I found painted a disturbing picture of a childhood marked by isolation and psychological trauma. The fractured childhood. When I interviewed Nathan, the middle brother who had been delivering papers when the attack occurred, he wasn't surprised by James's actions, only that it had taken this long. James was always different, Nathan told me, sitting in his new apartment, far from the neighborhood where he'd grown up. From when we were kids, there was something off about him. He didn't connect with people the way normal kids do. According to Nathan and other family members I interviewed, James had exhibited signs of severe social anxiety and possible selective mutism throughout elementary school. For nearly 6 years, he barely spoke to anyone outside the family, and even at home, his communication was minimal. There was this incident in 2nd grade, Nathan recalled. James wet himself in class because he couldn't bring himself to ask the teacher if he could use the bathroom. The other kids never let him forget it. They called him Puddles all the way through middle school. School records confirmed that James had been the target of persistent bullying. His teachers noted concerns about his social development, recommending psychological evaluation several times. But there was no evidence that Richard and Elena ever followed through with these recommendations. The Moreau household, it seems, was not the happy, cohesive family unit that neighbors perceived. Behind closed doors, Richard was reportedly a harsh disciplinarian with a drinking problem. Multiple sources confirmed that he would become physically abusive when intoxicated, particularly toward Elena and the boys. Dad had these rules, Nathan explained, ridiculous, arbitrary rules, and the punishment for breaking them was always severe. Once, James left a light on in the bathroom overnight. Dad made him stand in the corner for 8 hours straight. No food, no bathroom breaks. Elena, while not physically abusive, was described as emotionally distant. A talented pianist who had once harbored dreams of performing professionally, she seemed to resent the domestic life she'd settled into. She taught piano lessons from home, but, according to Nathan, showed little interest in her sons' lives or emotional well-being. Mom was just absent, he said, physically there, but mentally somewhere else. The only time she seemed happy was when she was playing piano or teaching her students. With us, it was like she was going through the motions. In this emotionally barren environment, James found escape in computers and technology. When the family got their first computer when James was 13, he became obsessed. It was his window to a world where he didn't have to speak, where no one knew about his school humiliations, where he could be whoever he wanted to be. He'd spend hours in front of that screen, Nathan remembered. Dad would yell at him to go outside, to be normal. But James just couldn't. The computer was his life. By high school, James had developed considerable programming skills. He joined the computer club and, for perhaps the first time, found a community where he fit in. His academic performance, which had been average at best, suddenly soared. He began winning mathematics competitions and science fairs. His senior year, he was offered a full scholarship to Carnegie Mellon's computer science program. But Richard had other plans for his eldest son. Dad forced him to turn down Carnegie Mellon, Nathan said, shaking his head at the memory. Said computer science was for socially awkward nerds, and that no son of his was going to waste his life staring at a screen. Dad had connections at Harvard through his construction business, a client whose brother was on the admissions board or something. He pulled strings, made James apply to the business school instead. This derailment of James's passion and future plans created what psychologists refer to as a narcissistic injury, a profound wound to one's sense of self. James complied with his father's demands, attending Harvard Business School and eventually taking a job in investment banking. But according to Nathan, he was never the same after that. It was like watching someone slowly disappear, Nathan said. Each year, there was less and less of James left, just this hollow shell going through the motions. As I listened to Nathan's account, I began to understand that the Internet James had referred to in his confession wasn't simply about connectivity. It represented his identity, his escape, his only sense of control in a life that had been largely dictated by others. When Richard cut that connection, he wasn't just removing access to websites, he was severing James's lifeline to the only world where he felt he belonged. But was that enough to explain such a violent eruption? I wasn't convinced. There had to be more to the story. The pressure point, 2 days before the murders, a significant incident occurred at the Moreau home. According to police reports, neighbors had called 911 after hearing shouting and the sound of objects breaking. When officers arrived, they found James in a state of extreme agitation, having thrown various household items at his family members. The responding officers noted that the situation had calmed by the time they arrived, with Richard assuring them everything was under control. No arrests were made, and the incident was logged as a domestic disturbance with no further action taken. This was a crucial missed opportunity. Had the officers dug deeper, they might have discovered what I learned from Thomas once he was well enough for a detailed interview. James had been staying with us for a few weeks, Thomas told me from his hospital bed, his voice still raspy from smoke inhalation, his burned skin covered in bandages. He'd lost his job at the bank being fired for erratic behavior, is how he put it. But Nathan found out later from a friend who worked there that James had threatened his supervisor after being passed over for promotion. This was new information that hadn't been in any of the files I'd reviewed. Further investigation confirmed that James had indeed been terminated from Reynolds Klein 3 weeks before the murders, though the official reason given was downsizing. James moved back home, but he wasn't looking for work, Thomas continued. He just stayed in his old room on his computer all day and night. Dad was getting frustrated, saying James needed to contribute to the household if he was going to live there. The night of the police visit, Richard had discovered that James had run up thousands of dollars in charges on credit cards he'd opened in his parents' names. When confronted, James had exploded in rage. He was screaming that it was his money, that Dad owed him for forcing him into a career he hated, Thomas recalled. He said if Dad hadn't made him go to Harvard instead of Carnegie Mellon, he'd be a successful programmer by now instead of a failure. After that incident, Richard had taken drastic measures. He changed the Wi-Fi password, disconnected James's computer, and even physically cut the internet cable leading to James's room. James just went quiet after that, Thomas said. Too quiet. He said something that night that none of us took seriously enough. He said, "If you cut off my internet, I'll kill everyone in this house and burn it to the ground." The family had dismissed it as an empty threat, the kind of hyperbolic statement someone might make in anger. They couldn't imagine he actually meant it. 2 days later, he proved them wrong. But as I pieced together the events leading up to that fatal night, I began to see discrepancies in the timeline, subtle inconsistencies that might have been overlooked in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy, but which now, with the benefit of time and distance, stood out like red flags. The midpoint twist, the unexpected revelation that changes everything. 4 months into my reinvestigation, I received a call from Dr. Sharma at Lakewood Regional Hospital. Elena Moreau, who had been in and out of consciousness since the attack, was lucid and asking to speak with me. When I arrived at her room, I was shocked by her appearance. Once a vibrant woman according to photographs, Elena now looked decades older than her 61 years. Burns covered much of her visible skin, and her once dark hair had turned completely white. But her eyes were clear and focused as I sat beside her bed. "Detective," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something about that night." I leaned closer, notebook ready. James didn't do it. I stared at her, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Moreau, but your younger son Thomas identified Thomas as wrong," she interrupted with surprising force. "I saw who did it. I was awake when it happened. According to Elena, she had been in bed, but not yet asleep, when she heard someone enter the master bedroom. Assuming it was Richard returning from the bathroom, she kept her eyes closed. Then she felt the first stab. I screamed, she told me. I opened my eyes and saw Nathan standing over me with a kitchen knife. Nathan, the middle son, the one who'd been conveniently out delivering newspapers when the fire started, the one who'd appeared so distraught, trying repeatedly to run back into the burning house. "Are you absolutely certain it was Nathan?" I asked. Elena's eyes filled with tears. "A mother knows her children, Detective. It was Nathan. When he saw I was looking at him, he said, 'I'm sorry, Mom,' and stabbed me again." She claimed to have lost consciousness after that, awakening briefly as smoke filled the room, then nothing until she was in the hospital. This testimony directly contradicted everything we thought we knew about the case. James was in custody. He had confessed. Thomas had identified him as the killer. But if Elena was telling the truth, then James's confession was false. And why would someone confess to a crime they didn't commit? I needed to verify Elena's account. The problem was, the physical evidence had been largely destroyed in the fire. The murder weapon had never been recovered. We had no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing concrete to tie either James or Nathan definitively to the stabbings. What we did have, however, was the timeline, and that's where I focused my attention next. The timeline discrepancy. I went back to the beginning, meticulously reconstructing the events of November 11-12, 2014. According to the newspaper distribution manager, Nathan had picked up his papers at 1:35 a.m. This was confirmed by security footage from the distribution center. His route typically took about 3 hours, and he always started at the far end of town, working his way back toward home. But witness statements from the night of the fire indicated that Nathan had been one of the first people on the scene, arriving almost simultaneously with the fire department at 2:20 a.m. How had he made it back home so quickly? His route would have taken him at least 5 miles away from the house by that time. I checked Nathan's phone records from that night. His cell had pinged off a tower near the distribution center at 1:40 a.m., consistent with him picking up his papers. The next ping was at 2:17 a.m. from a tower covering the area around the Moreau home. There was no activity in between, no pings from towers that should have registered if he'd been driving his route. It was as if he'd teleported from the distribution center straight back to the house. When I re-interviewed the neighbors who had been first on the scene, I discovered something else interesting. Mrs. Caldwell, who had called 911, mentioned seeing Nathan's car parked down the street just before she noticed the fire. I remember thinking it was odd, she told me. Usually his car isn't there when he's delivering papers. But I distinctly recall seeing it under the streetlight when I went to the window. This suggested that Nathan had returned home shortly after picking up his papers, rather than completing his route as he'd claimed. Then there was the testimony from firefighter Jenkins, who had been among the first responders. According to his report, when asked if anyone else was in the house, Nathan had initially said 6 people, before quickly correcting himself to 7.